I flew home with a black and gold box for my parents' 42nd anniversary, only to be blocked before half our town. My father swatted the gift away. My mother hissed, "I wasn't invited," while my sister smiled like she'd won a chess match. Nobody knew that box didn't hold a souvenir. It held the explosive truth about the very house they stood in. My name is Millie Green. I am 34 years old, and I stood on the porch of my childhood home in Ash Creek, Kentucky, holding a bomb wrapped in black and gold paper. It was a perfectly square box, heavy with the weight of carefully curated documents, tied tightly with a thick gold ribbon. It looked exactly like the kind of thoughtful, expensive anniversary gift a successful daughter would bring home from the city. But I did not come all the way from Stanton to offer empty congratulations. I came to burn a long-standing fiction to the ground. The warm night air hummed with the sound of cicadas, but it was entirely drowned out by the noise spilling through the screen door. Inside, my parents were celebrating their 42nd wedding anniversary. The house was packed. I could hear the upbeat tempo of a classic country song playing softly underneath the roar of 24 overlapping conversations, the sharp clink of silverware against porcelain, and the loud, booming laugh of my father, Warren Green. I rested my hand on the rusted handle of the screen door and paused. The music faded, replaced by the tapping of a spoon against a crystal glass. The chatter died down instantly. Then, the voice of my older sister, Raina, floated out into the humid air. "Mom, Dad," Raina began, her tone dripping with the kind of practiced warmth that made my stomach turn. 42 years. That is a lifetime of love, of sacrifice, and of building a home. And we all know what a sanctuary this house is, especially recently. When things got tough, we proved that this family stands together. I am just so incredibly grateful that I could be here for you both, to handle the heavy lifting so you did not have to worry about a single thing. To my amazing parents, I heard the collective murmur of agreement, the sound of glasses chiming together in a toast to the devoted, dutiful daughter. Raina had always known exactly how to play the room. She was the hero of a story she had entirely fabricated. I pulled the door open. The hinges gave a sharp, metallic whine that cut through the polite applause. I stepped into the entryway, the black and gold box held firmly in both hands. The living room was a sea of familiar faces. There were neighbors I had known since I was 10, church friends my mother saw every Sunday, and relatives who had bounced me on their knees. For a fraction of a second, a few of them smiled out of sheer reflex. Then, the realization hit them. The smiles vanished. A heavy, suffocating silence swept across the room like a cold front. It was the kind of social tension that physically presses against your chest. Every single pair of eyes locked onto me. I saw Mrs. Gable, who lived 2 houses down, suddenly find her shoes absolutely fascinating. Mr. Henderson coughed awkwardly and took a step back. It was as if uttering my name was a violation of the house rules. I was the ghost that was never supposed to crash the party. My mother, Elaine Green, stood near the makeshift buffet table. She wore a tailored blue dress I had never seen before. She stared at me, frozen. The polite, host-like expression melted off her face, leaving behind a rigid mask of sheer panic. She took one step forward, glancing nervously around the room, before her eyes settled back on me. Her voice was low, barely more than a harsh whisper, but in the dead silence of that living room, it carried perfectly to every person standing within 10 feet. "We didn't invite you." Raina handled the guest list. Before I could formulate a response to the raw, unfiltered rejection from my own mother, Raina materialized. She moved through the crowd with the swift, aggressive grace of a predator protecting its kill. She stopped right in front of me, effectively blocking my line of sight to the rest of the room. Raina wore a perfectly tailored floral dress and a smile that did not reach her ice-cold eyes. She leaned in close, the scent of her expensive vanilla perfume clashing with the stale smell of beer and fried food. "Millie, what are you doing?" Raina hissed, her voice a strained, melodic whisper meant only for me. "You need to leave, right now. Do not ruin their night before Dad sees you. You know his heart cannot take the stress of your drama." She reached out, her fingers digging sharply into my forearm, trying to physically pivot me back toward the door. She was desperate to get me and the box out of sight before the illusion shattered. "Let go of me, Raina," I said, my voice steady, completely devoid of the hysteria she was clearly hoping to provoke. "Well, well, well," a loud, booming voice shattered the quiet standoff. My father pushed his way through the crowd. Warren Green was a large man, a mechanic whose hands were permanently stained with grease, even in his best button-down shirt. His face was flushed, partly from the alcohol and partly from sudden, blazing anger. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence," my father sneered, stopping right beside Raina. He looked me up and down, his eyes landing with intense disdain on the elegantly wrapped box in my hands. "You have a lot of nerve coming here tonight, Millie. You disappear for months. You ignore your family when we are drowning in problems. And now you just show up with some fancy package when you want to look good in front of the neighbors." "Dad, I brought this for you and Mom," I started, holding the box forward slightly. "I do not want anything from you," he shouted, with a sudden violent sweep of his heavy arm. My father backhanded the gift box. The impact was loud. The heavy square flew from my grip, sailing through the air before crashing onto the hardwood floor. The thick gold ribbon snapped. The lid popped loose, but the contents remained mercifully tucked inside. A sharp, collective gasp echoed through the room. A few people physically recoiled. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. Raina stood perfectly still, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and quiet triumph. She thought she had won. She thought this public humiliation would finally break me, send me running back to Stanton in tears, cementing my role as the unstable, ungrateful daughter forever. I did not scream. I did not cry. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. The years of working in risk analysis had taught me how to compartmentalize chaos. I looked at my father's furious, panting face, and then down at the box on the floor. I slowly crouched down, keeping my back straight, and picked up the black and gold box. I secured the lid. I stood back up and looked my father directly in the eyes. "I brought something you should have known a long time ago," I said. My voice was calm, flat, and lethal. It was the kind of tone that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I saw Raina flinch. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him, my mother, and my sister, ready to walk out the door and take the truth back to Illinois with me. They had made their choice. They chose the comfortable lie over the difficult daughter. But as I reached for the screen door, I saw her standing by the coat rack in the corner, Aunt Nora. My mother's younger sister was watching me with an expression completely unlike the rest of the room. There was no pity, no judgment, only a deep, sorrowful understanding. She looked from me to the box, and then to Raina. In that split second, I knew she suspected the truth. She knew the math of Raina's stories never added up. I stopped. My grip on the box tightened. I made a sudden, irreversible decision. I was not going to carry this burden out the door with me. I changed my trajectory, walking straight up to Aunt Nora. The entire room held its breath, tracking my every movement. I held the black and gold box out to her. Nora looked at the box, her eyes wide, and then slowly raised her hands and took it from me. It was heavy. She nearly dropped it, but quickly adjusted her grip, holding it tightly against her chest. I leaned in, ensuring my voice was low, but just loud enough for the oppressive silence of the room to carry it to the people standing closest. "If they want to keep believing the lie, leave it," I told her, my eyes locked on hers. "If they want the truth, open it." I gave Aunt Nora one last nod, turned on my heel, and pushed through the screen door, stepping back out into the humid, loud Kentucky night, leaving the ticking time bombs squarely in the middle of their perfect celebration. To understand how a daughter becomes a ghost in her own family, you have to rewind 6 years. You have to understand the specific gravity of Ash Creek, Kentucky. It is a working-class town where loyalty is measured by how close you park your car to your parents' driveway on a Sunday afternoon, and where love is often confused with loud. Visible proximity. I grew up in a house that always smelled faintly of diesel fuel and damp earth. My father made his living as a heavy agricultural equipment mechanic. His hands were permanently scarred, his knuckles always stained with grease he could never quite scrub away. My mother worked part-time at the independent hardware store in town, spending her days sorting brass fixtures and mixing paint. We were not poor, but financial anxiety was a permanent resident in our home, sitting at the dinner table with us every single night in that environment. Coping mechanisms developed early. My sister, Raina, figured out exactly what our parents needed to see. She was the golden child of emotional optics. Raina possessed a magnetic charm, a flawless ability to communicate, and an uncanny talent for showing up at the exact moment the dust settled. I, on the other hand, was the fixer. I was the one who read the fine print. I remember a summer when the county sent an aggressive notice about a property line dispute. My parents were terrified and exhausted. Raina immediately rushed over, brewed a pot of sweet tea, sat on the porch with my mother, and held her hand while saying everything would work out just fine. Meanwhile, I spent 4 hours locked in my bedroom, poring over municipal zoning codes, making phone calls to the county clerk, and drafting a formal response letter that eventually dismissed the claim entirely. That evening, when the crisis was averted, my father hugged Raina tightly. He told her she was the glue keeping the family's spirits up. He looked at me, exhausted and rubbing my eyes from reading legal jargon, and told me I needed to smile more and stop being so tense. That was the blueprint of our family dynamic. In every holiday gathering, in every backyard barbecue, my father unconsciously elevated my sister as the devoted, caring child. She was the heart of the home. I was slapped with a different label. I was the stubborn one, the quiet one, the cold daughter whose brain worked like a calculator. When I graduated at the top of my high school class and eventually moved 400 miles away to Stanton, Illinois, the narrative only hardened. I did not move away out of spite. I moved because I was offered a brilliant position as an insurance risk analyst at Red Cedar Risk and Claims Group. I wanted to build a career where my meticulous nature was an asset, not an annoyance. I simply wanted to stop living in the suffocating shadow of my sister's manufactured halo. But in the Green family mythology, leaving town was synonymous with abandonment. During my first few years in Stanton, I tried fiercely to bridge the gap. I called home every Sunday afternoon. I never missed a birthday. I sent meticulously chosen gifts for Christmas, wrapping them myself and shipping them early. However, as the years stretched on, the responses from my parents began to dwindle, fading like a radio station losing its signal. My father stopped picking up the phone, and my mother's conversations became brief, tense, and painfully shallow. Whenever I asked what was wrong, the answers never came directly from them. They came through Raina. Raina became the self-appointed gatekeeper of the family. If I called and no one answered, my phone would buzz 10 minutes later with a text from my sister. She would offer vague, perfectly plausible excuses. She would say our father was having a hard time with his arthritis and was sleeping. She would say our mother was overwhelmed with work and needed space. "Do not make a big deal out of it, Millie," Raina would tell me over the phone, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "You know how they get. They are just busy. I am here keeping an eye on them. Just focus on your city life." I believed her. I swallowed the guilt, assuming my absence had genuinely hurt them and that I just needed to give them time. Until one incredibly tiny, seemingly insignificant detail unraveled the entire tapestry of her lies. It happened during my third winter in Illinois. My mother had been complaining about poor circulation and the bitter cold drafts in their house. I spent nearly $200 on a premium, heated weighted blanket. It was soft, therapeutic, and exactly what she needed. I shipped it directly to Ash Creek with a handwritten card. A week later, I asked Raina if the package had arrived. Raina sighed heavily into the receiver. "It got here," Raina said, sounding apologetic. "Look, Millie, I do not want to hurt your feelings, but Mom really does not like it. She said it is way too heavy, it suffocates her, and the fabric makes her itch. She feels bad, but she just put it away in the top of the guest closet. Maybe next time. Just send a gift card. You are a little out of touch with what they actually need. The rejection stung sharply. I felt like a failure of a daughter, entirely disconnected from my own mother's comfort. I did not bring it up to my mother, too ashamed to mention the failed gift. 4 months passed. It was spring, and I happened to catch Aunt Nora on the phone just to catch up on town gossip. Aunt Nora was my mother's younger sister, sharp-witted and wonderfully unfiltered. Halfway through the conversation, she casually shifted the topic to the weather. "It is still freezing down here at night," Aunt Nora laughed, "but your mother is doing just fine. I was over there last Tuesday, and she is absolutely obsessed with that gorgeous gray heated blanket you sent her for Christmas. She wraps herself up in it every single evening on the recliner. She told me it is the best gift she has received in 10 years. I stopped breathing for a few seconds. I sat at my kitchen island in Stanton, staring blankly at the wall. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a miscommunication. It was a calculated, deliberate lie. My training at Red Cedar Risk and Claims Group kicked in. When investigating insurance fraud, you do not look at the grand, sweeping statements. You look at the mundane discrepancies. You look for the pattern. If Raina was willing to lie to me about a blanket just to make me feel inadequate, and presumably taking the credit for making my mother comfortable, what else was she lying about? I realized the terrifying genius of my sister's strategy. Raina was actively controlling the flow of information. She was a human firewall. She told our parents one version of reality, painting me as distant, uncaring, and entirely absorbed in my corporate life. She told me another version, painting our parents as exhausted, indifferent, and perpetually disappointed in me. She engineered the isolation so perfectly that our mutual misunderstandings would never, ever meet in the same room. We were all reacting to ghosts that Raina had designed. The sorrow I felt morphed instantly into a cold, analytical focus. This was no longer just a matter of difficult sisterly dynamics or childhood jealousy. This was emotional sabotage. I did not call Raina out. I did not scream or demand an explanation. I knew that without hard, undeniable proof, Raina would simply twist the narrative, play the victim, and convince my parents that I was acting crazy. Instead, I opened a new, encrypted folder on my personal laptop. I began to archive everything. I saved every text message Raina sent me. I screenshotted her social media posts. I logged the dates and times of my unanswered phone calls to my parents. I forwarded every family-related email to a secure address. My professional intuition screamed at me that a storm was coming, and when it finally hit, I would need more than just my word to survive it. I was no longer just a sister trying to find her way home. I was an investigator building a file. The spring storm that tore through our region was entirely unforgiving. The local meteorologists called it a catastrophic weather event, the kind that only happens once every 20 years. Huge, jagged chunks of hail hammered the aging roof of my parents' house for nearly an hour, violently fracturing the protective shingles and exposing the vulnerable underlayment to the torrential downpour that immediately followed. Water seeped through the shattered barriers, rushing down into the attic and saturating the thick fiberglass insulation. The heavy, wet material pressed down on the ceiling joints. A massive, sickly yellow water stain quickly spread across the living room ceiling, right above the velvet sofa where my mother liked to read. In the dark, humid corners of the upper crawl space, toxic black mold quietly began to bloom. I did not hear about the severity of the damage from my mother or my father. I heard about it from Aunt Nora. She called me late on a Tuesday evening, her voice trembling with a mixture of panic and exhaustion. "The city sent a certified letter," Aunt Nora whispered into the receiver, clearly stepping outside onto her own porch so she would not be overheard. "It is a residential safety violation notice. The Code Enforcement Division gave them 30 days to fix the structural damage and mitigate the water intrusion. If they do not hit that deadline, The county will start slapping them with daily fines, and they are threatening forced remediation. Forced remediation meant the city could legally hire their own contractors to fix the hazard and then bill the homeowner at double or triple the market rate. It was a financial death sentence for people living on a fixed retirement income. I immediately called my sister. Raina answered on the second ring, sounding breezily annoyed, like I had interrupted a spa treatment rather than a family emergency. I told Mom and Dad not to bother you with this. Raina sighed, perfectly playing the role of the protective, overwhelmed older sibling. You do not need to stress your pretty head about a little rain damage. I am handling absolutely everything. The insurance company already approved the assessment. I have got it entirely under control. But my ears were professionally trained to hear exactly what people were carefully avoiding saying. I worked at Red Cedar Risk and Claims Group. I handled complex disaster recovery files and liability disputes every single day of the week. Raina's verbal assurances were entirely devoid of any concrete specifics. She did not casually drop a claim number. She did not mention the name of a general contractor or a local restoration company. She offered no timeline for the mandatory structural dryout process or the roof replacement. It was pure, corporate-style deflection dressed up as sisterly affection. I dug into my personal archives, scrolling through years of saved files until I pulled up an old forwarded email where my mother had once attached a scanned copy of their homeowner's insurance declarations page. Armed with the policy number, I called the carrier directly the very next morning. Since I was still listed as an authorized emergency contact on the original file from when I lived at home, the customer service representative was willing to confirm the basic status of the claim. The adjuster's log notes were an absolute revelation. The claim had indeed been approved. In fact, a primary settlement check for $22,500 had been issued and legally cashed exactly 5 weeks prior. 5 weeks. And yet, Aunt Nora had just told me there were cheap blue plastic tarps still violently flapping on the roof, and plastic utility buckets catching dirty water drips in the main hallway. My professional instincts kicked into high gear. I accessed the county clerk's public property records portal online, running a search on the family address. What I found on the digital registry made my blood run completely cold. There was a fresh, severe encumbrance attached to my parents' property title. It was a mechanic's lien. A small, local roofing supply company had filed a legal claim against the house for unpaid debts. The sworn affidavit stated they had delivered raw materials to the property site and commenced preliminary tear-off work, but the homeowner's representative had abruptly locked them out of the site and terminated the verbal agreement without paying the initial materials invoice of $8,400. A mechanic's lien is not a polite request for payment. It is a legal chokehold. It clouds the title, makes it impossible to sell or refinance the home, and if left unresolved, it gives the unpaid contractor the legal right to force a foreclosure sale to recoup their money. My sister was sitting on a cashed insurance check of over $20,000. The roof of our childhood home was literally rotting away. The municipal government was threatening to fine my parents into eventual bankruptcy, and a furious local tradesman had just put a legal target on the deed to the property. I called Raina again that afternoon, framing my questions casually to see exactly how far she would stretch the lie. She smoothly complained that the local construction market was just completely booked up. She claimed every single reliable roofing crew in the tri-state area was busy dealing with the storm fallout and that she had secured a spot on a premium waiting list. The paper trail I had just uncovered told a violently different story. Raina had not been waiting patiently in line. She had hired and fired 2 different independent contractors within a single month. She had signed incomplete work authorizations, argued over basic material costs, and essentially paralyzed the entire restoration project through sheer incompetence and her desperate need to be the smartest person in the room. She wanted to play the heroic savior, but she had absolutely no idea how to manage a legitimate construction project or handle vendor relations. And instead of admitting she was drowning, she let the house rot while looking my parents in the eye and promising them everything was fine. I sat alone at my desk in Illinois, staring at the blinking cursor on my dual monitors. I had a choice to make, and it was the most agonizing crossroad of my adult life. The first option was explosive. I could buy a plane ticket, fly down to Kentucky, slap the printed county clerk records and the insurance payout confirmation directly onto the dining room table, and expose Raina right then and there. It would start a nuclear family war. My father would likely refuse to believe the documents initially out of sheer denial. My mother would probably have a panic attack. Raina would immediately spin the narrative, accusing me of illegally hacking their private financial information out of jealousy because she was the one taking care of them. The emotional fallout would take months to settle, and during those months of screaming matches and silent treatments, the city would start levying daily fines of $250, and the mold would permanently consume the load-bearing beams of the house. The second option was silent. I could fix it quietly. I could leverage my professional network, neutralize the legal threats, hire competent professionals, and save the physical structure of the house before it was legally condemned. I chose the house. I chose to swallow the bitter, burning injustice and do the actual, grueling work, knowing full well that Raina would eventually take all the credit for my labor. It was a calculated decision that would cost me an immense emotional price over the next several years, slowly hollowing out my relationship with my parents. But a family divided by lies cannot stand, especially when the roof above their heads is literally caving in. Within 24 hours of discovering the legal chokehold on my childhood home, I retained a senior partner at Hale and Mercer Title Counsel, a specialized real estate firm operating just outside my hometown border. I needed an advocate who possessed the local authority to navigate county municipal courts, but who was removed enough from our immediate community to avoid the rampant small-town gossip. My directive to the senior attorney was simple, cold, and entirely professional. I demanded a complete, unvarnished autopsy of the property's legal and financial standing. I needed to know every single vulnerability my sister had created. The initial title search returned results that were significantly worse than a simple unpaid contractor dispute. The house was not just facing a localized mechanic's lien, it was actively bleeding on multiple fronts. My attorney informed me that the county property taxes from the previous fiscal year were severely delinquent. The account was mere weeks away from triggering compounding municipal penalties, which would inevitably open the door to a tax certificate sale. My parents were blindly inching toward losing the home they had owned for over 4 decades. They were completely oblivious to the danger because my sister was actively intercepting the mail, filtering their reality, and feeding them a daily diet of comforting delusions. I had to intervene, but I had to do it invisibly. My father was a man woven entirely out of blue-collar pride and stubborn independence. If I marched down from Illinois, waving a checkbook and highlighting his immense financial failures, his shame would instantly curdle into defensive anger. He would reject the help outright, viewing it as a condescending lecture from his distant, corporate daughter. More importantly, Raina would immediately weaponize that interaction to banish me from their lives entirely. I had to operate like a ghost in the machine, to protect their pride and bypass my sister's gatekeeping. I opened a dedicated escrow account through a separate, neutral financial institution. I funded this account by liquidating a significant, painful portion of my own long-term stock portfolio, transferring the cash over in a single, heavy wire transaction. I instructed Hale and Mercer Title Counsel to act as a blind intermediary. They were legally authorized to negotiate, settle debts, and hire vendors under the guise of an anonymous family trust management group. The financial hemorrhage had to be stopped in a highly specific, tactical order. First, my attorney contacted the furious roofing supplier who had filed the lien. We wired them the exact amount of their unpaid materials invoice, plus a 15% inconvenience fee, making the payment strictly contingent on them signing and officially filing an unconditional release of lien with the county clerk. Once the title was legally unclouded, we paid the accumulated municipal safety violation fines in full, stopping the clock on the city's threats. Then, utilizing the law firm's escrow, I contracted a highly reputable, bonded roofing company to perform emergency water mitigation and locked in a firm schedule for a complete structural tear-off. Because the roof had been left exposed to the brutal elements for weeks while my sister played the role of a competent project manager, I could not just replace the surface shingles. I authorized and paid for a specialized engineering firm to conduct a deep structural inspection of the upper attic space. My professional paranoia proved entirely justified. Rainwater had pooled along the primary load-bearing joists, causing early-stage wood rot and feeding a significant bloom of toxic mold within the insulation. The necessary environmental remediation and structural reinforcement pushed the total project cost wildly beyond the original insurance payout. I was draining my personal savings, quietly wiring tens of thousands of dollars into the void to save a house I was barely welcome to step foot in. It was during the final review of the cleared county property records that the ground completely fell out from under me. My attorney sent over a secured, encrypted file containing all recent financial inquiries and legal drafts attached to the property's specific parcel number. Tucked deep inside the digital stack was a preliminary draft for a secondary, high-interest home repair financing loan. The application listed the property as the primary collateral. At the very bottom of the signature page was a digital scan of my father's signature. I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the glowing monitor until my eyes burned. The loops of the ink were far too tight, the angle too rigid and practiced. It completely lacked the heavy, sweeping, uneven pressure of my father's thick, grease-stained hands. But the physical forgery itself was not the most chilling part of the document. It was the timestamp stamped right next to the signature line. The document had been signed and notarized on a Tuesday in late October. I vividly remembered that specific Tuesday because it was the exact day my father was admitted to the county hospital, heavily sedated with intravenous painkillers for a minor vascular procedure. He was physically incapable of holding a pen, let alone comprehending and signing a legally binding financing contract. Someone else had signed his name to mortgage his home. The urge to detonate the entire family dynamic right then and there was nearly overwhelming. I had the smoking gun of actual financial fraud staring me in the face, but my training in risk analysis held me back. If I struck now, without seeing exactly how far the loan application went, or where the stolen money was intended to flow, I might only catch my sister on a technicality. She was a master manipulator. She would undoubtedly claim it was a simple misunderstanding, crying that Dad gave her verbal permission while medicated, and that she was only trying to secure extra funds to help them. I needed an absolutely airtight trap. I instructed my attorney to secure the draft, forensically timestamp the digital metadata, and lock the file down tight. We would not alert the private lender. We would not tip off the local authorities. We would simply wait in the shadows. 4 months later, the dust finally settled in Ash Creek. The roof was a pristine expanse of architectural shingles. The attic was structurally reinforced, completely dry, and chemically treated for mold. The municipal fines were erased from the county ledger. The property taxes were paid in full, and the deed was completely clean. I had spent nearly $40,000 of my own hard-earned money to pull my parents back from the edge of absolute ruin. But back home, the narrative remained perfectly, maddeningly intact. My parents sat safely in a dry living room, completely unaware of the legal war that had been fought and won on their behalf. They only knew what they were told, and what they were told was a masterpiece of fiction. Raina confidently claimed she had worked miracles, aggressively haggled with difficult contractors, and single-handedly saved the family home from disaster. I stayed in my apartment 400 miles away, listening to my sister take the glowing bows from my blood, my sweat, and my capital. I let her build her pedestal higher and higher, knowing that a taller pedestal only meant a much more devastating fall. The physical restoration of the house was complete, but the psychological reconstruction of our family history had just begun. My sister did not merely step into the vacuum I had deliberately left. She built an entire monument to herself right in the center of it. She recognized that a brand new roof, a cleared legal title, and a structurally sound attic were undeniable, highly visible trophies. All she had to do was claim she had hunted them down. She utilized the finished repairs to completely rebrand her image among our extended relatives. She was no longer just the charming daughter, she was the ultimate martyr. Word began to filter back to me through the dense grapevine of our hometown. Raina was telling aunts, uncles, and family friends that she had spent weeks aggressively hustling money to cover the massive shortfall the insurance check left behind. She fabricated dramatic stories about going toe-to-toe with shady contractors, claiming she had to negotiate under the table late at night just to keep a crew on the job. She painted a picture of herself running through a burning building while I was safely tucked away in my corporate office hundreds of miles north, entirely unreachable. The most agonizing part was how deeply my parents bought into the fiction. During a late summer barbecue in their newly protected backyard, my father stood up with a beer in his hand and made a public toast. He did not know I was listening through the phone. Aunt Nora had quietly dialed my number and slipped her phone into her pocket so I could hear the festivities. I stood by the window of my apartment, the phone pressed hard against my ear, as my father's booming voice echoed over the line. He raised his glass to Raina, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. He called her his rock. He told a crowd of nearly 40 people that she was the only one who truly stepped up when the family was facing absolute disaster. He said he did not know where they would be without her taking charge of the crisis. Hearing your own father passionately praise someone else for the grueling, invisible war you fought and financed on his behalf is a profoundly disorienting kind of grief. It is a pain that does not make you cry. It simply hollows you out, leaving behind a cold, ringing emptiness, empowered by her newly cemented status as the savior of the family. Raina rapidly expanded her territory. She used the momentum of the roof crisis to wedge herself into the rest of our parents' financial lives, under the guise of preventing future emergencies. She convinced our mother to let her help manage the monthly bills. She argued that our parents were getting older and might miss a deadline, so she needed full access to their checking accounts and utility portals. She was slowly closing her hand around the operational throat of the household, and my parents were smiling while she did it, confusing her control with devotion. Simultaneously, she began a quiet, surgical campaign to erase me from the family calendar entirely. The holidays and birthdays rolled around, but my invitations vanished. If I called to say I was booking a flight down for Thanksgiving, Raina would immediately intercept. She would call me back 10 minutes later. Her voice hushed and heavy with fake concern. She would tell me that our father's blood pressure had spiked that morning. She would say the house was a complete mess and our mother was simply too exhausted to host. "Just stay up there this time," Raina would urge softly, sounding like the voice of reason. "Do not come down and add to their stress right now. They need a quiet holiday. I will drop off a turkey for them and make sure they are okay. We will FaceTime you." They never FaceTimed, and the holidays were never quiet. I would eventually get a text from Aunt Nora, casually mentioning how wonderful the food was at the massive Thanksgiving gathering my parents hosted. Noting that all the cousins and neighbors were there, the house was packed. The only person missing, the only person deemed too stressful to be present, was me. My sadness hardened into something much sharper and much more dangerous. I was not just drifting apart from my family. I was being actively, methodically excised from their lives. The narrative Raina built was entirely fake, but its execution was ruthlessly consistent. Small, jagged pieces of evidence constantly surfaced to remind me of my erasure. Raina posted heavily edited photos on her social media feeds, standing proudly in the front yard with the new roof gleaming in the background. Her captions read things like, "Roof done, crisis handled, family first." I would see comments from our old neighbors praising her endless dedication. Occasionally, a neighbor would send me a vague, awkwardly worded message saying it was such a blessing my parents had my sister nearby during their hard times. Worst of all was the terrifying, deafening silence from my parents. They never called to ask why I missed Christmas. They simply accepted the version of reality where I did not care enough to show up. Throughout this suffocating period, the only thing keeping me anchored to reality was Evan Cole. Evan was a custom carpenter I had been dating for about 2 years. He was a man defined by a quiet, grounded strength. He worked with his hands, understood the integrity of raw materials, and possessed an incredibly fine-tuned radar for bullshit. He did not need to be told the entire saga to know I was drowning. He saw the sudden, drastic shifts in my lifestyle. He noticed when I quietly canceled our weekend trips because I had drained my savings account to zero to pay off the mechanic's lien. He saw me picking up extra risk assessment contracts, working until 2 in the morning just to rebuild my emergency fund. Evan never interrogated me. He never demanded I explain where tens of thousands of dollars had disappeared to. Nor did he push me to confront my family before I was ready. Instead, he simply stepped into the gaps. When I was too exhausted to grocery shop, he filled my fridge. When my car needed new brakes and I was terrified of the expense, he spent his entire Sunday in my driveway covered in grease, replacing the pads himself. He offered me a steady, unshakable foundation of actual support, which stood in violent contrast to the loud, performative theater of my sister. He knew I was carrying a massive secret, and his response was simply to help me carry the weight until I was strong enough to drop it. I maintained my silence for a long time. It was not out of weakness, and it was certainly not out of a desire to keep the peace. I stayed quiet because I had to keep my primary objective in focus. The house had to be physically secured first. If I had exposed Raina prematurely, the ensuing chaos would have derailed the construction, invited the municipal fines back, and ultimately destroyed the property. I chose to secure their shelter before I cleared my name. It was a noble decision, but an incredibly dangerous one. By remaining a ghost, I gave my sister the uninterrupted time and space she needed to build an ironclad armor of lies. She had convinced the entire town that she was the hero. She had entirely rewritten history, and I knew that when the time finally came to strike a match and burn her narrative down, a few printed emails would not be enough. I was going to need a paper trail so devastating that no amount of her charm could possibly survive it. Exactly 12 months after the final county inspection approved the new roof on my childhood home, my secure personal phone rang. It was the senior partner at Hale and Mercer Title Council. I had paid the firm a small, continuous monthly retainer to keep a passive monitoring flag on the county property records. A paranoid professional precaution that I had sincerely hoped would be a complete waste of money. It was not. We caught an active ping on the parcel number, the attorney told me, his voice entirely devoid of small talk. A local private equity lending group just pulled a hard title search and requested the historical deed records for your parents' address. My stomach dropped, the blood rushing in my ears. A hard title search is never a random administrative error. It is the mandatory, aggressive first step an underwriter takes when a piece of real estate is being pre-qualified to be leveraged as collateral. Someone in Kentucky was actively trying to borrow a significant amount of money against my parents' house. I authorized Hale and Mercer to dig deep into the inquiry, regardless of the exorbitant billable hours it would require. By the end of the week, the attorney had back-channeled through the local financial network and extracted the rough framework of the pending transaction. The applicants pushing for the commercial line of credit were my sister, Raina, and her husband, Derek Shaw. Derek owned a struggling retail sporting goods store on the edge of the county limit, a business that had been quietly bleeding cash for nearly 3 years. Their personal credit scores were completely hollowed out by late payments and maxed-out credit cards. To secure a high-risk lifeline loan from a private, high-interest lender, they desperately needed a substantial, unencumbered asset to anchor the application. They were using my parents' newly repaired home as a primary reference asset, attempting to establish a guarantor relationship to artificially inflate their approval odds. The most chilling part of the lawyer's report was the supplementary documentation Raina had provided to the underwriter. My attorney managed to confirm that my sister had submitted a legally binding financial power of attorney draft, right alongside the old repair consent forms from the previous year's storm damage. She was not just claiming she managed the house socially, she had actively woven a fabricated financial history into a formal banking application. Raina was telling the private lending board that she was the sole financial caretaker of the property. using the massive capital improvements, the very roof and structural reinforcements I had paid for as documented proof of her own liquidity and asset management capabilities. It was a terrifying masterclass in document manipulation. While it did not quite cross the threshold into prosecutable criminal wire fraud, because the final loan documents had not yet been executed and signed by a notary, it was standing right on the edge of the cliff. If I had not secretly retained the original, stamped receipts and bank transfers, Raina's fabricated application would have eventually hardened into official financial history. The lie was migrating from harmless family gossip into the permanent, legal banking system. If she defaulted on that business loan, the private lenders would have a documented avenue to place a lien right back on my parents' property. The sheer audacity of her scheme snapped something deep and fundamental inside my chest. The era of my passive, silent observation was officially over. I cleared my heavy oak dining room table in Stanton, powered up my dual monitors, and began to construct a weapon made entirely of paper. I called it the truth file. I knew that in a family deeply conditioned by emotional manipulation, I could not rely on my word against hers. I printed everything on thick, premium stock paper. I pulled the original roofing contractor invoices, highlighting the exact total cost of the labor and materials. I printed the official wire transfer confirmation numbers directly from my bank in Illinois, irrevocably proving the outbound flow of capital from my personal accounts. I secured a freshly stamped, certified copy of the mechanic's lien release from the county clerk. I included the formal settlement letter from Hale and Mercer Title Council, and the official municipal receipts showing the city code violation fines had been paid in full by my blind trust account. I meticulously organized the documents chronologically, drafting a clear, undeniable, single-page timeline of every single dollar that had saved the property. While I was assembling the heavy binder, my phone vibrated. It was Aunt Nora. Her voice was unusually tight, completely lacking its usual sarcastic edge. She had called to vent about a recent family dinner she had attended, but her frustration quickly spilled over into a revelation that made my hands shake with sheer, unadulterated rage. "I need to tell you something, Millie, and you are going to absolutely hate it," Nora warned, taking a sharp, ragged breath. "I was in the kitchen with your mother and Raina on Tuesday afternoon. Your mother was worrying about her winter heating bill, and she casually mentioned maybe calling you to ask for a little help since you have that big corporate job. Do you know what Raina said to her?" I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white. "Tell me." "Raina looked her dead in the eye," Nora continued, her tone dripping with disgust, "and said, 'Do not bother, Mom. Millie never sent a single dime when the roof caved in. She just likes to act rich and show off from the city. You cannot rely on her for real money.'" She said it so smoothly, like it was an established historical fact. I closed my eyes. The puzzle was finally, horrifyingly complete. Raina was not merely stealing the credit for my financial sacrifice to make herself look like a hero. She was actively, maliciously assassinating my character to our mother. She was intentionally poisoning the well, ensuring that my parents would never reach out to me for financial clarity, because they had been thoroughly brainwashed to believe I was nothing more than a selfish, boastful fraud. She had buried me alive in my own family so she could safely strip mine their remaining assets in the dark. I looked down at the massive stack of certified documents covering my table. I had the power to stop the commercial loan dead in its tracks right that second. I could call the private lender, submit the undeniable proof of fraud, and watch Raina's financial life burn to the ground from 400 miles away. I could call the local police department and report the forged power of attorney, but a quiet surgical strike would not solve the root of the psychological rot. If I handled this in the shadows, Raina would simply play the ultimate victim. She would run crying to my parents, claiming I had ruthlessly sabotaged her husband's struggling business out of spite and jealousy. My parents, deeply conditioned by years of her soft manipulation, would instantly believe her. The lie would survive, mutate, and continue to exclude me. I realized that the only way to kill a lie this massive, a lie that had infected an entire community, was to drag it into the blinding light. I needed an audience. I needed the exact same audience that Raina had spent years performing for. I looked at the physical calendar hanging on my office wall. My parents' 42nd wedding anniversary was exactly 3 weeks away. Raina was already aggressively planning a massive, catered party at the house, promoting it on social media as a grand stage where she would undoubtedly play the role of the perfect devoted daughter managing the family estate. I made my final decision. I was going not only to break the lie, but I was going to shatter it with undeniable, notarized documents, right in the middle of her perfect theater. I reached for a thick, elegant gift box I had specifically purchased for the trip. It was wrapped in heavy black paper with a bright gold interior. I began carefully placing the stacks of evidence inside, making sure the timeline rested right on top. I was going to give my parents exactly what they needed for their anniversary. I was going to give them the brutal, unvarnished truth, and I was going to hand it to them in front of every single person who had ever doubted me. 3 weeks before my parents were set to celebrate their 42nd wedding anniversary, my sister made her move. I was sitting in my living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon when a notification popped up on my phone. It was a public social media post from Raina. She had uploaded a beautifully filtered picture of an elegant floral arrangement with a glowing caption announcing an intimate, family-only gathering to honor our parents' marital milestone. The event was scheduled for the second Saturday of the following month. I checked my direct messages, my email inbox, and my voicemail. There was nothing. The pattern was playing out exactly as it always did. I was being publicly excluded under the guise of a fiercely protective, exclusive family event. I did not wait for Aunt Nora to call and break the news. I dialed my sister's number directly. She picked up on the third ring, her voice coated in a thick, impenetrable layer of artificial sweetness. I asked her point blank about the anniversary party and why I had not received the details or an invitation. Raina did not stutter, nor did she sound even slightly guilty. She simply shifted into her highly practiced, patronizing tone. "Look, Millie," Raina sighed softly, playing the role of the exhausted, deeply caring peacemaker. "I just do not want any drama on Mom and Dad's special day. You know how tense things get when you come down from the city. They are getting older, and they just need a peaceful afternoon surrounded by the people who are actually here for them every single day. It is nothing personal. I am just protecting their peace." I ended the call without raising my voice. That brief, chilling conversation confirmed the most dangerous variable in this entire equation. Raina was utterly convinced that she still held absolute, unbreakable control over the family narrative. She firmly believed that even if I tried to speak up, our parents would inherently choose her comfortable, loving fiction over my complicated, absent reality. She was banking on their emotional inertia. She thought I was too weak to fight back in public, and she thought they were too blind to ever seek the truth. The next morning, I initiated the final phase of my plan. I contacted the senior partner at Hale and Mercer Title Council and requested an expedited, physically certified package of every single document we had generated over the past year. I did not want digital files or standard photocopies. I demanded heavy, watermarked paper bearing the official raised seal of a licensed notary public. I needed the undeniable, crushing weight of the law on my side. Within 48 hours, a thick manila envelope arrived at my apartment via an overnight courier. I cleared off my dining table, wiping the wood clean as if I were preparing a sterile operating room. My hands were trembling slightly, not out of fear, but from the immense, suffocating gravity of what I was about to do. I was assembling a weapon designed to meticulously destroy my sister's reality. I started building the layers of evidence. The foundation of the collection was the bank records. I included a certified affidavit from my financial institution in Illinois, explicitly tracing the flow of tens of thousands of dollars directly from my personal savings account to the escrow account managed by the law firm. There was no room for Raina to claim the funds magically appeared from a government grant, or that she had supplied them in cash. The financial paper trail was absolute and undisputed. On top of the banking logs, I placed the structural proof. I laid down the pristine, post-repair inspection certificate issued by the county, immediately followed by the formal legal release of the mechanic's lien. Next came the stamped municipal receipts, proving that the city code violation fines and the severely delinquent property taxes had been paid down to the very last penny. I knew my parents well. My father was a lifelong mechanic, and my mother worked retail. They were not corporate financial analysts. Handing them a stack of dense, intimidating legal jargon would only confuse them and give Raina a crucial window to twist the meaning of the paperwork. To permanently close that window, I drafted a single, brutally clear timeline. I used bullet points and bold text, mapping out the exact date of the roof collapse, the issuance of the insurance check that Raina had secretly cashed, the subsequent legal threats against the house, and the exact dates my money arrived to neutralize those threats. It was designed so that a person with absolutely no legal background could understand the entire magnitude of the betrayal in less than 60 seconds. Then, I added the kill switch. This was the surprise element, the document that would force my parents to make an immediate, legally binding choice. I had my attorney draft a comprehensive, ironclad revocation of power of attorney. It explicitly terminated any and all financial, medical, and administrative authority Raina or her husband currently held over my parents' estate. I placed this single document inside a crisp white envelope, clearly labeled. If my parents chose to accept the truth of my documents, they could sign that paper right then and there, permanently cutting off Raina's access to their remaining assets and halting her fraudulent commercial loan application dead in its tracks. The final piece of the puzzle was the hardest to assemble. It could not be printed from a computer or stamped by a lawyer. I took out a piece of plain, heavy stationery and a blue ink pen. I sat at my dining table for over 2 hours, crying quietly as I drafted a handwritten letter to my mother and father. I did not use the letter to attack my sister. The bank records and the legal timeline would do that forcefully enough. Instead, I used those pages to finally speak the words I had swallowed for almost a decade. I wrote that I moved away to build a life where my skills could be useful, not to abandon the family that raised me. I explained that when their house was falling apart, I chose to work in the cold shadows, because preserving their dignity and saving their shelter was far more important to me than receiving a public round of applause. I told them I did not want their gratitude, nor did I want them to pay me back a single cent of the money I had spent. I only wanted my name back. I only wanted them to know who their youngest daughter truly was. I folded the handwritten letter carefully and placed it right on top of the printed timeline. I gathered the entire stack of documents, the white envelope containing the revocation, and the letter, and placed them into a heavy, perfectly square gift box. I had spent weeks searching for the right wrapping materials. I finally found a thick, textured roll of matte black paper and a spool of wide, shimmering gold ribbon. Black and gold were the exact colors of my parents' wedding party, 42 years ago. It was a deliberate, deeply personal choice. Despite the devastating, explosive nature of the contents, I wanted this box to look beautiful. I wanted it to represent a genuine anniversary gift. It was a painful, heavy offering, but it was born out of a desperate, enduring love for my family and a desire to save them from ruin. I tied the gold ribbon into a tight, flawless bow. I pressed my hands against the cool, smooth surface of the box, taking one long, shuddering breath. The procedural part of the operation was officially over. The evidence was sealed. The only thing left to do was pack my car, drive down to Kentucky, and walk straight into the fire. The drive from Stanton, Illinois, down to Ash Creek, Kentucky, took exactly 6 hours and 45 minutes. For the entire duration of the trip, the heavy square gift box wrapped in thick black and gold paper rested squarely on my lap. I refused to place it on the passenger seat or toss it into the trunk. I needed to sense its solid weight resting heavily across my thighs. That tangible pressure served as a physical reminder of the reason I was putting myself through this. The highway lines blurred into a monotonous gray streak beneath my tires, but my mind was violently awake. I felt a strange, chilling calmness settling over me, the kind of emotional flatline that only arrives when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. Yet, beneath that icy exterior, A quiet, terrifying fear pulsed in my chest. I was carrying an undeniable mountain of certified, notarized truth, but I was driving toward a family that had spent years aggressively conditioning themselves to prefer a comfortable, beautifully decorated lie. What if the paperwork was not enough? What if they looked at the undeniable proof and simply chose to look away as I crossed the county line into Ash Creek? The familiar, suffocating gravity of my hometown pulled at me. I navigated the narrow, winding streets I had memorized as a child, finally turning onto my parents' block. The scene waiting for me was almost violently picturesque, a perfect slice of manufactured Americana. Vehicles were parked tightly along both sides of the street, stretching for nearly 2 entire blocks. I had to park a significant distance away and walk back toward the property. As I approached, the visual and auditory assault of the celebration hit me. Warm, glowing yellow string lights were meticulously draped back and forth across the front porch railing, illuminating the manicured lawn. A massive, professionally printed vinyl banner hung prominently above the main entryway, proudly declaring a happy 42nd anniversary for Warren and Elaine. The heavy, humid evening air was thick with the rich, smoky scent of barbecued brisket, baked beans, and sweet corn. It was a classic, potluck-style small-town gathering. To any random passerby, it was the absolute pinnacle of a warm, loving, tightly knit community celebrating enduring love. But as my heels crunched softly against the gravel shoulder of the road, I did not feel warmth. I felt like a hostile intruder approaching a heavily fortified castle. I was the ghost that had been successfully exorcised from the premises. Instead of walking straight up the concrete path to the front door, I moved slowly through the shadows of the large oak trees anchoring the front yard. I stopped near the large bay window of the living room. The glass was pushed open to let in the evening breeze, but the thin mesh screen provided a veil between me and the packed room inside. From the darkness of the yard, I stood completely still and watched the curated history of the Green family unfold. Someone had set up a large, bright projector screen against the far wall. It was continuously looping a digital slideshow of family photographs. I stood outside in the dark and watched my own erasure projected in high definition. There were faded, sepia-toned wedding photos from over 4 decades ago, showcasing my parents looking impossibly young and hopeful. There were childhood snapshots of family camping trips and awkward middle school graduations. But as the digital timeline marched closer to the present day, my face simply vanished from the screen. Out of 100 photos, I appeared in exactly 3. In all 3, I was relegated to the blurry background, a marginalized extra in the movie of my own family. My sister, however, was the undisputed, shining star of the entire production. The slideshow was not a collection of memories. It was a carefully constructed propaganda reel designed to canonize Raina. The screen flashed a bright, high-resolution image of Raina standing victoriously in the front yard, pointing proudly at the brand-new architectural shingles I had secretly paid for. The next slide showed a candid, deeply moving photo of Raina holding our father's arm as she walked him out of the local medical clinic. Then, a picture of her sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by a mess of generic utility bills, looking appropriately stressed but heroically dedicated to managing the household. It was a masterpiece of visual manipulation. She had visually documented every single fabricated milestone. I tightened my grip on the black and gold box until my knuckles ached. I finally stepped out of the shadows, walked up the wooden steps of the porch, and pulled the screen door open. The living room was packed shoulder to shoulder with people holding plastic cups of beer and paper plates loaded with food. As I crossed the threshold into the bright, noisy house, I braced myself for the immediate chill I knew would follow, but before the awkward tension could fully set in, a voice pierced the ambient chatter. "Well, my goodness. Look who finally made it home. Millie is here." It was Mrs. Gable, an elderly neighbor who lived 3 houses down and had largely been shielded from the toxic inner workings of our family politics. She possessed no filter and a naturally booming voice. Her genuine, joyful greeting acted like a sudden thunderclap in the room. Several other older neighbors turned around, their faces breaking into surprised smiles, completely oblivious to the fact that I was actively blacklisted. The sudden, chaotic ripple of attention completely shattered the perfectly controlled atmosphere Raina had spent weeks building. My sister was standing near the stone fireplace at the front of the room, holding a crystal glass half full of sparkling cider. She was right in the middle of delivering a toast. Mrs. Gable's loud interruption caused Raina to physically stumble over her words. For one fraction of a second, Raina's flawless, loving smile violently cracked, revealing a flash of pure, unadulterated fury before she desperately wrestled her mask back into place. "Yes, wonderful!" Raina projected her voice loudly, straining to drag the spotlight away from the entryway and back to herself. As I was saying before we were joined, I just want to thank every single one of you for being here tonight. You all witnessed this family get through a truly terrifying phase with the house last year. It took countless late nights, incredibly tough negotiations, and more personal stress than I care to ever admit, just to keep a safe roof over my parents' heads. But family does whatever it takes. We protect our own. To Mom and Dad, the crowd murmured in deep, emotional agreement, raising their glasses high in the air. I did not raise my hands. I did not speak. I simply stood near the door, absorbing the absolute audacity of her speech. She was claiming my sleepless nights, my depleted bank accounts, and my crushing anxiety as her own personal victories. Through the shifting crowd, I caught sight of Aunt Nora standing near the edge of the hallway leading to the kitchen. Nora did not raise her glass to Raina's toast. Instead, her sharp, perceptive eyes locked onto me, and then slowly dropped to the heavy square box in my hands. Aunt Nora possessed a dangerous intuition. She saw the rigid, military-like way I held my shoulders. She noted the deliberate, significant choice of the black and gold wrapping paper. In that silent exchange across the crowded room, Nora's expression shifted from mild shock to a deep, solemn understanding. She knew I had not brought a souvenir. She knew I had brought an ending. I forced myself to look away from Nora and focus on my parents. Sitting in the center of the room, my father was looking at Raina with an expression of pure, unfiltered adoration. My mother had actual tears welling in her eyes, completely captivated by the beautiful fiction my sister was spinning. Seeing the absolute conviction on their faces was the most devastating moment of my entire life. It was a physical blow to my chest. They had not merely been tricked into believing Raina's lies, they had actively chosen them. They wanted to believe that Raina was their savior, and by extension, they had to believe that I was the villain. They looked at me as an outsider, a volatile element that could only bring drama and ruin their perfect, harmonious evening. That realization cut deeper than the impending public humiliation ever could. The applause for Raina's speech died down, and the eyes of the room began to slowly, uncomfortably pivot back toward me. The heavy, suffocating silence of judgment began to fill the air. But I did not shrink back toward the door. I did not lower my head. I kept my spine perfectly, rigidly straight. I refused to react to the scrutinizing glares of the church ladies or the sudden, icy stare Raina was now shooting in my direction. I knew that tonight was not about trading insults. It was not a petty competition over who could shout the loudest or cry the hardest. This was a clinical execution. I was stepping onto the battlefield for a direct, unavoidable collision between a deeply entrenched psychological manipulation and a stack of indisputable, legally binding reality. I adjusted my grip on the box, took one steady breath, and prepared to burn the house down. The murmur of the crowd died a sudden, unnatural death, completely smothered by the humid Kentucky air pouring through the open windows. The upbeat country music still played softly in the background, but the cheerful notes now felt entirely grotesque against the heavy, suffocating tension that had just seized the room. My mother stood near the makeshift buffet table, her hands nervously smoothing the fabric of her tailored blue skirt. She did not look angry, which somehow made the moment infinitely worse. She looked inconvenienced, like a host dealing with a misplaced catering order rather than a mother looking at her youngest child. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked any maternal warmth or even fiery indignation. It was entirely flat, carrying perfectly across the sudden vacuum of sound in the crowded living room. "We didn't invite you. Raina handled the guest list." It was a dismissal so casual it took the breath right out of my lungs. It was not an attack. It was a total erasure. She was confirming, in front of dozens of witnesses, that I was no longer considered a member of the inner family circle. I forced my chest to expand, drawing in a slow, measured breath to steady my racing heart. I walked forward, closing the distance between the entryway and the main seating area. I spotted a small, decorative wooden table overflowing with greeting cards and hastily wrapped presents. I carefully set the heavy, square box wrapped in black and gold paper down right in the center of the pile. "I am only here to congratulate you both on your 42nd anniversary," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and respectful. "I brought a gift. I am not here to cause a scene." I was offering them a golden bridge to walk across. I was giving them an exit strategy. All they had to do was say thank you. Let me leave the box on the table and allow the evening to proceed with their public dignity completely intact. But my sister could never allow a narrative to exist that she did not personally direct. Raina detached herself from the stone fireplace and intercepted me with terrifying speed. She positioned herself squarely between me and the gift table, her back entirely turned to our parents so they could not see her face. She adopted the hushed, aggressively soothing tone of a professional crisis manager dealing with a highly volatile, unreasonable client. "Millie, please," Raina whispered, her smile wide and completely dead behind her eyes. "Look at what you are doing. You're upsetting Mom and Dad on their special night. Just turn around and walk right back out that door. We can talk about your feelings next week over the phone. But tonight is not about you. Do not be toxic." She reached out, attempting to place a firm, patronizing hand on my shoulder to physically steer me out of the room like a confused trespasser. I sidestepped her touch with a sharp, fluid motion. The sudden movement caught my father's attention. Warren Green marched forward, pushing past two of his old hunting buddies. His face was flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson, fueled by a mixture of cheap beer and sudden, defensive rage. He glared at me, and then his eyes darted to the elegant black and gold box sitting on the table. In his mind, completely poisoned by years of Raina's constant, subtle whispers, this was not a gesture of love. This was an arrogant display of wealth from his absent, snobby city daughter trying to steal the spotlight. "You think you can just show up here acting like the perfect daughter," my father bellowed, his loud voice rattling the framed pictures on the living room wall. "You ignore us for years. You leave your sister to handle the real problems when the house is falling apart. And now you parade in here with some fancy box expecting us to clap for you. We do not want your guilt trips." Before I could utter a single syllable in my defense, my father raised his heavy, calloused right hand and violently swept it across the table. The impact was deafening in the quiet room. The heavy square box launched into the air, crashing brutally onto the hardwood floor. The thick gold ribbon tore with a sharp snapping sound. The lid skewed sideways, but the dense stack of certified, notarized documents remained wedged tightly inside the dark cardboard. The sound of the box hitting the floor physically split the room in two. Half of the guests, mostly the church friends and older relatives, immediately dropped their gaze, staring intently at their shoes in absolute burning mortification. The other half remained frozen, their eyes wide with morbid, silent fascination. I slowly scanned the faces of the people who had known me since I was born. I waited for one person, just one, to step forward and tell my father he had gone way too far. I waited for someone, anyone, to defend the girl they had watched grow up in this very town. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. The loyalty of Ash Creek belonged entirely to the story my sister had sold them. The rejection was absolute. But strangely, it completely severed the last remaining strings of my childhood desperation. The wounded girl hoping for her parents' approval evaporated. leaving behind a woman with a cold, surgical clarity. I slowly bent down, keeping my back completely straight and my eyes fixed unwaveringly on my father. I picked up the battered black and gold box and adjusted the lid, securing the truth back inside. I stood tall, clutching the heavy package to my chest. "I did not come here to beg for your validation," I stated, my voice echoing off the silent, wood-paneled walls. "And I did not come to play a background character in Raina's play. I came to deliver a gift that took me years to prepare, but you have made your choice." I turned on my heel, ready to carry the truth back out into the night and let them drown in their own manufactured reality. But as I reached the edge of the hallway, a hand clamped firmly onto my wrist. It was Aunt Nora. She was standing perfectly still, her face pale but her grip surprisingly strong. She did not look at my parents, nor did she look at Raina. She looked directly at the battered box in my arms. "Leave it," Nora whispered, her voice rough and thick with emotion. She stepped directly into my path, blocking the exit, and held out both of her hands. "Give it to me, Millie." I hesitated. I looked into Nora's eyes, seeing the desperate need for clarity burning brightly behind them. She knew the math of this family never added up, and she was finally demanding to see the ledger. I slowly lowered the box and placed it into her waiting hands, feeling the physical transfer of the immense burden. I took one step back toward the screen door, but before I crossed the threshold, I delivered the final, irrevocable condition. I spoke loudly enough for every single person hiding in that room to hear the exact terms of my surrender. "If they want to keep believing her," I said, pointing a single, steady finger directly at Raina, whose face had suddenly drained of all color, "tell them not to open it. Just throw it in the trash and forget I was ever here. But if they want to know whose money actually paid for the house they are standing in, tell them to open the box." I did not wait to watch the fallout. I pushed open the screen door and walked down the wooden porch steps into the thick, humid Kentucky night. As I walked down the street toward my parked car, I could hear the faint, awkward sounds of the party attempting to resuscitate itself behind me. Someone nervously turned the volume of the music back up. I heard the forced clatter of a fork against a porcelain plate, but there was no laughter. The congratulations had died completely in their throats. I drove away, leaving them locked in a house with a black and gold box sitting on a table, resting there like a silent, unsworn piece of undeniable evidence waiting to finally detonate. The heavy wooden screen door clicked shut behind me, but the tense silence I left inside the house did not last long. According to Aunt Nora, who recounted every agonizing second of the fallout to me later that night, my departure created a massive, suffocating vacuum that my sister immediately tried to fill. "Well, that was incredibly dramatic and completely unnecessary," Raina announced, her voice pitched an octave too high, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. She clapped her hands together, a sharp, artificial sound. "Let us not let her ruin this beautiful night. Who is ready to cut the anniversary cake?" She gestured enthusiastically toward the massive, three-tiered vanilla cake resting on the dining counter, but nobody moved. The crowd of neighbors, church friends, and extended relatives remained firmly rooted to the floorboards. The manufactured spell of the evening had been irreparably broken. Aunt Nora walked deliberately to the center of the living room. She carried the battered package wrapped in black and gold paper. She set it down firmly on the exact same wooden table my father had just cleared with his furious fist. "No," Nora said, her voice sharp enough to cut solid glass. "We are not eating cake. Tonight, we either open the truth, or we live with a miserable, rotting lie for a few more years." "I am choosing the truth." Raina lunged forward, desperate to snatch the cardboard box away. But Derek, her own husband, caught her arm. The sheer, naked panic radiating from my sister was finally too obvious for anyone in the room to ignore. Nora pulled off the torn gold ribbon. She lifted the heavy lid. The first thing she pulled out was the single-page timeline I had meticulously drafted. Nora did not hand it over for my father to read privately. She read it aloud to the completely silent, captive room. She read the exact dates of the spring storm. She read the specific date the massive insurance check was issued and legally cashed by Raina. Then, she read the dates the municipal safety fines hit the property, the day the local roofer filed the mechanic's lien, and finally, the exact dates that tens of thousands of dollars were wired directly from my personal bank account in Illinois to save the property from total foreclosure. "Every single bill," Nora announced, holding up the thick, heavy stack of notarized construction receipts, title clearances, and bank affidavits for the entire room to see. The new roof, the structural repairs, the property taxes, all of it was paid in full by Millie Green. The atmosphere in the room violently inverted. The same neighbors who had just been raising their glasses and nodding in deep sympathy for my sister's supposed sacrifices were now staring at her with undisguised horror. The whispers began, rippling through the crowd like a sudden electrical current. But Nora was not finished. She reached back into the box and opened the crisp white envelope. She pulled out the draft of the commercial loan application. "And this," Nora continued, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that demanded absolute attention, "is a draft for a high-risk business loan. Derek and Raina were actively trying to use this newly repaired house as collateral to save their failing retail store. They attached a forged power of attorney to the file to bypass you both." Millie's lawyer caught it. He included a formal note right here calling it textbook financial abuse. My father physically collapsed into his worn armchair. The color entirely drained from his face as the crushing reality of his golden child's ultimate betrayal washed over him, beside him. My mother buried her face in her hands and began to sob openly. The tears were not just for the stolen insurance money or the terrifying near loss of their family home. They were the bitter, agonizing tears of a mother realizing she had been systematically manipulated into throwing her youngest daughter away. Raina tried one last, desperate pivot to save herself. "I was only trying to help," she cried out, pointing wildly toward the front door I had just walked through. "I was going to pay the loan back. Millie just plotted this whole thing to ruin your 42nd anniversary. She is vindictive and jealous, but the performance was definitively over." The physical documents laid out on the table were entirely immune to her emotional gaslighting. Even Derek stepped away from her, rubbing his face in utter public humiliation, completely unable to spin a story that could clean up a certified paper trail of fraud. My father's large, calloused hands were shaking so violently that he could not pick up the final piece of paper resting in the box. He nodded blindly at Nora. My aunt gently unfolded my handwritten letter and read my words to the silent room. She read how I left Ash Creek to survive, not because I stopped loving them. She read how I chose to fix their roof in the dark, because protecting their pride and their physical shelter mattered vastly more to me than receiving a public round of applause. That letter was the final, lethal strike to my father's stubborn pride. The realization that the daughter he had just publicly humiliated was the exact same person who had quietly sacrificed her own financial future to keep a roof over his head broke him completely. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, heavy sobs. Right there, with the warm string light still glowing on the porch, and the neighbors watching in stunned silence, the ultimate knot of our family trauma was severed. Nora handed my parents the legal revocation form I had prepared. My father asked Mrs. Gable to hand him a pen from her purse. Using the coffee table as a desk, both of my parents signed away every single ounce of Raina's financial and medical authority, with Nora and 2 neighbors serving as immediate, legally binding witnesses. 5 minutes later, as I was navigating the dark county highway back toward the interstate, my cell phone lit up brightly on the dashboard. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the seconds tick by. I let it ring. I let it ring until it clicked over to voicemail. Reclaiming the truth does not mean the bleeding stops instantly, and I was not ready to speak. Back in Ash Creek, the grand party ended. The massive anniversary cake sat entirely uncut on the kitchen counter. The cheerful country music played to an empty room as the guests quietly, awkwardly shuffled out into the night. But the air in the house was finally clean. The gift I brought did not destroy their anniversary. It surgically removed a toxic cancer that had been eating their marriage, their home, and our family history alive for years. The epilogue to this brutal chapter of my life did not happen over a phone call. Less than 24 hours later, on a bright Sunday morning, a heavy, hesitant knock echoed through my apartment in Stanton. I opened my front door. My father and mother stood together in the hallway. They looked 10 years older, physically exhausted and entirely stripped of their previous stubborn pride. In my father's hands, clumsily taped back together, was the black and gold box. They did not speak right away. My mother's eyes were red and swollen from a sleepless night of crying. I did not fall into their arms. I did not offer them a sweet, cinematic forgiveness, because the deep emotional wounds they helped inflict would take years of actual work to heal. But I looked at them, standing there holding the box of our shattered and rebuilt history, and I took a step back. I opened my door wider, giving them enough space to finally step inside. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment below, letting me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support the channel by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.